Thank you.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. So this is going to be about the perception that we're now calling proximity. This was a name for the perception chosen by Tapiolecki, and who's been doing very interesting work in this field. I've been talking about it for now about 10 years, but I've been using all kinds of other names for it, starting with engagement, and there's a reason for that, and then other terms like clarity or presence. They all pretty much mean the same thing. But I'm going to try and use the term proximity in this talk. But before I'm going to talk about that, I want to demonstrate proximity for you. And I'm going to do that using these two little speakers here. Tapiolecki, as you probably know, has a little electronic orchestra with 17 players. And he sets that up on a stage. And he tries to control the directivity of the speakers so that it's close to that of the actual instruments. And each instrument plays an anechoic track that was recorded. So we have 17 different instruments playing at once. I'm taking two of his instruments, the first and second violin of a little piece of Mozart, and I'm going to play it through these two speakers on this stand here. And it should sound like two violins playing. Power. Okay, now, I just tried this in this room. If you go and stand, or just where you're listening, you probably can tell which speaker is playing which note. You can localize these precisely. At least, I can. Okay, now if you walk backwards, in a room that's slightly more reverberant this, you'll find a very definite spot where you can no longer do so. Okay? In a space of less than a meter, it goes from being completely localizable to being complete mush. Now, it's very difficult to, if we had real violinists here playing, you'd never hear it, because your eyes would take over. And even though the sound was mush, you'd be quite sure you're hearing which instrument is playing which note because you can watch them do it. Okay? This business of finding a position where you can no longer localize, which is what I call the limit of localization distance, can really only be determined if you have your eyes closed for a live performance. But with two speakers here, you have no clue as to who's bowing which note. Okay? And so you can actually do this. Now, I did this earlier, and about 2/3 of the way back toward the rear wall, it disappears. If anybody wants to try that, go ahead, I'll play it again. But if nobody gets up, I'll turn it off. Please, go ahead and do it. It's fun to do this. That's much too close. You have to go much further back. It's a very dry room, so this works that way. I think you'll all hear it pretty separately until you're almost to the back wall. At least that happens to me. And the interesting thing is people agree. Well, I think I want to stop it here and say that's enough of that demonstration. Whether it worked or not, you get the idea. In a slightly more reverberant room, like a concert hall, an opera house, or even a classroom, this is very well treated, this room. You may not like it, but the clarity is pretty good. Now, I'm going to do a further demonstration, and that is I'm speaking now with the microphone, and I want you to just turn off the mic. Can you turn off the mic so I'm completely dry? Okay. Now I'm talking without a microphone, but I'm just talking to you. And very typically, you'll find that, well, when I did this earlier, last talk, everybody was looking at the slides, or they were looking at each other, or they were looking at their cell phones. And when you turned off the microphone, everybody looked at me. Okay? That's what I want as a lecturer. I want you to be looking at me because the chances that you'll remember what I say are much better if you're paying attention. And I'm trying to demonstrate that there's a sonic property of attention. And the sonic property of attention is if you have a signal that goes directly to the audience from where you are visually, and it has this kind of crisp clarity, then you have what I call auditory proximity. That's what I'm talking about. So, why did we not discover audio? You can ask, why haven't we never heard about this before? Why haven't we discovered it? And the answer is that you have to listen without a visual image. That's very uncommon. And to study proximity in the laboratory, your reproduction system must be able to reproduce it. Okay? And how do you do that? What do you need for that? Well, actually, Tapiolokki knows the answer to that. You need a single loudspeaker for each voice. Now, I have this slide just because it's so pretty. Back in about 1916, Alva Edison was demonstrating this diamond disc recording system and playback system with live versus recorded performances. Honestly, he hired sopranos to stand next to one of his phonographs in record stores, which there were then, and sing, and then they'd play the same soprano on the disc, and people would say, do they sound the same? And the fact is, they did. People poo-poo this demonstration. He did it in Carnegie Hall. It's very famous. And everybody says that can't possibly work. That's wrong. It does work. This system plays back a soprano extremely well, which is why he was using sopranos. But it's a single source. It's a single exponential horn. The diamond connects directly to a diaphragm of a horn. And the phase response is very good for a soprano. And it sounds like he's right in front of you. I heard one of these. It was absolutely astounding how good it was. So Loki succeeds in detecting proximity by following these simple rules. One loudspeaker array, he uses 2 per instrument, and an independent anechoic track for each instrument, and reproducing each instrument through a single loudspeaker as close as possible to the original azimuth. Okay, and this is what I was just demonstrating, the limit of localization distance. Now, when somebody asks me to comment about why a particular hall isn't sounding right, or can I help them with that, the first thing I do is set up this system. Actually, I use 5 or 6 loudspeakers and have a bigger ensemble. And I walk around and I map out the LLD. And you can find out how many seats are inside the LLD, how many seats are outside. And then I try and figure out how to make the LED larger. And that's what I'm going to talk about. Okay. Close and attention grabbing might also be descriptors for proximity. I've already talked about that a little bit. Sounds that have proximity are perceived as close to a listener, both in natural hearing and in a mix. Sounds with proximity pop forward out of background sounds, and our brains involuntarily pay attention to close sounds because they might be dangerous. And we have evolved that we have to pay attention to things that might be close. How can we detect? Do we know that a sound is close to us? Because you can distinguish that in 1/10 of a second or less. I can say, boo, and you know it's close, okay? Right? And I don't have to hold a whole sentence. No current hearing model can explain that distance perception. In fact, I've been talking about it now for about 10 years. The problem is there's something really missing from standard models of hearing, which basically haven't changed from the time of Lord Rayleigh, who decided that spectrograms were a good idea. The missing element is the phase of harmonics above 1,000 hertz. All the textbooks say you can't hear phase above, say, 1,500 hertz because the hair cells don't fire fast enough, and they fire randomly up there, so you can't hear phase. That's completely untrue. For speech, if you read Blauert's Spatial Hearing on page, I think it's 151, he says clearly, if you use speech as a sound source, you can localize the sound by ITD alone over the entire audio frequency range. That's true. I just did the experiment. I can say, however, that at high frequencies, your ability to do it above about 6 kilohertz, it gets pretty hard, but it's still there. And I'm going to play you a little example here of reflections on speech. And I'm going to try and use these little speakers to do it. Let's see if this works. I hope it will work. All right. So this is a little speech I have. Let's play. If I record my voice with a microphone close to my mouth, the sound is very close to the ear of the listener. present, very clear. However, if I scramble the harmonics above 1000 hertz, the sound is very different. It might be perceived as distant or muddy. Okay, so to make this track, I took this impulse response, which is a all-pass filter, and I applied it to this speech. And this is the muddled speech. And there's no change in the amplitude, there's no change in the frequency response, but the sound is extremely different. And you can look at the parameters here. C50 and C80 are infinity, and RASTI is 0.93. So current theories would say this sounds perfect, and it very clearly does not. And it very clearly does not hold attention. Why? What's different about it? Well, it turns out that when the vocal cord opens, it makes a little pop, and that makes a very sharp peak in the amplitude. And what you're seeing here is the amplitude envelope of a signal, not the carrier. So this is at, I think it's at 1000 hertz. So this is a third octave filter at 1000 hertz, and you can see very sharp amplitude peaks at the fundamental frequency. The ear can hear that just fine. This is a whisper at the same thing, so that this sounds like this. Okay, this has been filtered at a third octave band at 1000 hertz. Yet you hear the fundamental perfectly well because of these peaks. And the ear hears them too, and it says, that's close, whereas the whisper, it doesn't know where it is. Okay. These spikes are also very important for a different reason. They're important because if you have the right kind of filter, you can separate this particular pitch from another by using some kind of a comb filter or an autocorrelator. And it turns out that JCR Licklider, which is somebody I really have never met because he died before I really got into this business, but in 1951, he proposed that you could only explain human hearing if along the basilar membrane for every band there's an autocorrelator attached, which is looking for those kinds of spikes. Okay? And he very clearly says in this little abstract here that, this has to be the case. There's no other way to explain the way ear hears. And I think he's absolutely right. I mean, this paper is kind of forgotten, but it shouldn't be. People have kind of lost talking about the basilar membrane as having a place sensitivity. That's the distance along this axis. And also a pitch or a neurological, you might call it a fundamental detection system of an autocorrelator. And the nice thing about that is you can have two people talking at once at slightly different pitches, and this system can separate them. In fact, I'll demonstrate this. This is a pitch. I'm speaking in monotone at a pitch of C, and I'm also speaking in monotone at a pitch of C sharp, and I'm saying something else.
This is speaking in a monotone at a middle C. It is still instantly recognizable as my voice. It is easy to understand every word. As clear because the vowel form and frequencies are exactly the same. And play to separate this from the pitch at the same time, you should concentrate on listening to the difference in pitch. This one is somewhat higher.
Well, I don't know. If you listen to that twice, you'll be able to hear each one separately. You can listen to the higher one, you can listen to the lower one. Your ear does this just fine. Okay. My model does this. It's not quite as good. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about that. You can make an autocorrelator model, and I have these models by adding it looks like Licklighters, and you find you can separate sounds like this. Just a quick go over the organ of Corti. We don't need to look at that really a lot. But you see there's the inner hair cells, the outer hair cells, and the auditory nerve. Let's skip that. Let's move on to, well, what happens if you try to, well, this separation process and the proximity depends on these pulses. Okay, and that's because the harmonics that form the pulses are all phase locked to each other because they were all created at the same instant. Okay, but reflections randomize them, which is why the one I played later sounded completely different, because the phases were randomized. Well, Arabi actually studied that in terms of your ability to recognize speech. He made this system here where he adds a random variable to the phase component of a standard word list and ask what does that do to the intelligibility of that signal in the presence of noise. And the answer is really extraordinary. When you add noise, the error rate at this level of noise is 10%. You lose 10% of the words. When you get to a phase randomization, a peak phase randomization of plus or minus pi over 2, it suddenly jumps. It doubles, at least. The error rate doubles. And that same thing happens for all levels of noise. So that randomizing the phase has a very substantial effect on word intelligibility. But that's not what interests me, really. It's word recognition versus recall. Rabi's shown that the phase randomization can dramatically increase word recognition rates. Decrease. Phase randomization decrease word recognition rates in the presence of noise. So I didn't catch that before, wow. But word recognition is only a first step. We need to be able to recall what happens at a later time. And a primary determinant of recall is attention. Okay, so the fact that this kind of speech grabs attention is very important. It might increase your ability to remember what was said. So how can we measure? Can we measure, and how can we predict this thing of proximity? A practical autocorrelator of the type Licklider proposed needs to be about 80 milliseconds long to achieve human pitch acuity, and a minimum of about 5 equally spaced taps is required. With this knowledge, we have developed a measure called LOC that predicts when a sound source becomes distant or not localizable. And what we did is I did an experiment with male speech, and what this experiment is I made a reverberation of a 1 second reverb time out of just decaying random noise. And then you vary the direct to reverberant ratio until you can just localize voices, 2 voices like this, exactly like this experiment. Okay, except they alternate. So one says, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that. With space, enough space in between that the reverberation decayed in between each example. And I got these thresholds. So this was actually about a 15 millisecond zero base pre-delay. I got a -8 for the reverberation, direct to reverberant ratio. In other words, you can localize at -8 D to R in this situation. And then as you increase the pre-delay, it goes down at a certain slope. And then I did it for a 2 second reverberation time, and I got a much lower. So at 2 seconds and about a 15 millisecond time delay gap, I got 13, a -13 DDR, and that goes down much further as the pre-delay increases. Now, actually, this slope determines the length of the autocorrelator, actually. If it was a shorter one, the slope would be steeper. If it was a longer one, the slope would be shallower. I don't need to explain that right now. But I'm going to make an example. And this is a just great example, and I hope I have time. Oh, I'm doing very well. Good. We have lots of time. So this is an example. I can explain how I did it. I have 2 seats here in Boston Symphony Hall. This one happens to be R11. Both of them are near the right-hand sidewall, okay? Not real close, but they're not in the center, okay? And this is R11. You can see the direct sound is actually quite strong. There's the lateral reflections here. This is some sort of floor reflection or something. And you get this kind of decay. And in this one, this is DD11. It's considerably further back into the hall, but it's at the same distance to the sidewall. But you see there's a very strong reflection from the right-hand sidewall in that seat, okay? Well, I made these measurements with Ning Chen and a bunch of students at RPI. I put a little Genelec 1029 up here by the conductor, and I measured, well, in this example, I measured 5 seats. I actually measured 10, but I've only got 5 on the slide. Okay, and what I have here, this is seat DD11, that's this seat here. And this is a sound field representation of that impulse response. And so you can tell exactly that this reflection is from the right-hand sidewall. Okay, we know that. Now, to make this interesting, you have to do a number of things. First, we have to equalize this because this impulse response was recorded with a dummy head and a sound field microphone. You need to know the frequency response of the speaker and the dummy head. You have to get that all straight. And so I made the assumption that if we go to 160 milliseconds of the decay, that's about out here, that you'd get a flat power spectrum. And I equalized that power spectrum to make it relatively flat. Okay, that's a particular example. If you run that, it gets quite smooth. All right, and then I looked at with that equalization, this is the equalization of the direct sound. And you can see the direct sound has no bass. That's because of the seat dip effect, which you probably all know about. Bass gets absorbed. The bass comes later. Here's the first reflection. You can see there's plenty of bass, but you also see something interesting. There's a dip here and a peak there, and that's an indication that that reflection is actually double. So you get a reflection off the balcony ceiling to the wall, and you get a reflection directly off the balcony wall to you. So you get two reflections in almost the same time. They interfere to give you that spectrum, okay? But it also means it's pretty loud, all right? So direct sound, first reflection, and reverberation. Well, we can create an ensemble from a single binaural measurement by simply modifying the direct sound. So we have this impulse response, we have the direct sound from the speaker, but if we just vary the ILD and the ITD a little bit, we can make an ensemble. And so I did that, and I used many of Tapio-Loki's binaural tracks to make the little Mozart piece as if it was in a small area around the loudspeaker in the front. So MATLAB script, you say, please do it to the MATLAB program I wrote, give it the binaural data, and out comes these tracks. You get a binaural track for the direct sound only, a binaural track for the first reflection only, and a binaural track for the reverberation without the direct sound and without the first reflection. So now you can listen to them in different combinations and see what the effect of that reflection is, which I'm about to do. Okay? So here we have it. I'm going to play the direct sound. That's the top track. This is the direct sound. And it sounds like this. Well, that's actually, it has no bass. It sounds a little tinny because there's no bass, okay? But it's very direct. It has proximity, no question about it. You can hear exactly well. Unfortunately, I'm playing it in stereo here, so it's muddled the phases. You probably don't hear it as really proximate, but it's good enough. All right, now I'm going to play the first reflection only. Oops. Sorry. Oh, no, what am I doing wrong? Let's try tapping over here. So it's got the bass. It's muddy. It has no proximity. And it's all on the right. Can you all hear that? This probably should be easy. Okay. And now I'm going to play the two together. This is the direct sound and the first reflection together. It's muddy. And it's to the right. Okay. Now I'm going to play the reverb only. Okay, well, now you can hear right away that most of the loudness is in the reverberation. Okay? And in fact, if I delete that first reflection, when I play them all together, the loudness doesn't change at all. All of the acoustician says, oh, you need strong lateral sidewall reflections because it gives body and loudness to the sound. I've heard this so many times I get a little bit tired of it. I actually got tired of it very quickly. Because it's simply not true. There's not enough energy in a single reflection to change the loudness in a hall like Boston Symphony, or any hall, really. There's so many late reflections that they overwhelm such a thing. Okay, so we're going to play it all together. Okay, well, you can sell the ticket. You can sell a ticket for that seat for about $60. Okay, but it's not a good seat because everything's muddy and all mushed together. But now I'm going to delete the first. So now this is the direct sound and the reverberation, no first reflection. Okay, you can sell that seat for $100. They don't because the reflection's there. So can you measure it? Well, these are my LOC measurements for the different cases. The one on the left here shows the LOC in the left ear. That's the one not near the wall at that seat. And you see LOC is actually quite high. This is the reverberant energy as it builds up, and this is the direct sound energy at that seat as a function of time. You assume the direct sound is constant, and you see how the reverberation builds up. LOC is simply the ratio of the areas. The area under the red curve to the area under the blue curve is the LOC in dB. Okay? And if we go to the one in the middle, that's the one of the right ear with the first reflection. And you can see what happens. That first reflection comes along, it's loud. So the reverberant energy jumps way up right at that point. And LOC goes way down to 1.2, which is too low. That's not a good number. So what happens if I delete that reflection? Well, now the reverberation doesn't jump up like that. It builds up gradually, and you get an LOC of 5.6, which is good enough, and you just heard it. So you know it's good enough. It sounds good. Conclusions. Proximity is the perception that source is acoustically close, is an important determinant of attention and recall. In fact, it may well be the most important determinant of attention and recall. If you read Loki's recent paper, that's what he's found. The presence or absence of proximity in a particular seat can be determined by listening for the localization of instruments from a small, usually electronic ensemble. You can do it with live instruments, but you have to shut your eyes. And if you walk backwards with your eyes shut, you might run into something like a microphone in the middle of the aisle. The ear detects proximity through the phase coherence of upper harmonics in the direct sound, which are randomized by early reflections. That's what I thought about 2 weeks ago, and I'm now studying that over again. Keep tuned. I think there's another physical mechanism. I'm not quite sure what it is, but all my work on this was done with male speech, my own speech, and I started studying how you can localize violins, because here there are two violins, that's not male speech. But it comes out about the same. And I don't understand the physics of that. So there's other physics, but it works about the same way. Binaural technique with individual headphone equalization is a practical standard against which other Hall research techniques can be judged. I haven't talked about individual headphone equalization in this talk. I talked about it on Thursday. And the difference that it makes if you have headphones to match the transfer function from the headphone to the eardrum and not to any blocked or open ear canal or even an IEC coupler, you have to go to a human eardrum, and everybody's transfer function for that is different. Not just a little bit different. You get plus or minus 8 dB differences between individuals in the range of, say, 1,000 hertz to 8 kilohertz. HRTF's all very interesting. People study the high frequency variation of sound. But the variation of timbre going from a headphone to eardrums is way bigger than any of these HRTF things. And if you equalize that individually, and it's easy to do, the difference is astounding. I did this for Betsy Cohen last night, and she said, the sound's up here. I said, we got it right, and the sound is in front, and I'm in Boston Symphony. And she was just saying, is she here? She can deny it if she wants, but she's not. Anyway, that's a typical reaction. Existing binaural data can be balanced and equalized to yield a very good snapshot of sound of an ensemble in a particular seat. This data can be further manipulated to discover why the sound is good or how to improve it if it's not. So I'm a big believer in this. You can spend $100,000 and make a 42-channel ambisonic system to do this kind of work. Or you can get a pair of headphones and equalize them to your ears, when you can do this with iPads, iPhones, which actually work very well once you equalize them if they happen to fit you. It's not costly to do this. Using these techniques, we find that the first order reflections, lateral reflections in Boston Symphony are excessive in every seat. They're either inaudible or they're detrimental. If you hear them, you don't like them. You can switch them out and the sound is better. And that's not what the textbooks say. So I stop there.
Thank you very much, David. We're out of time, so if you have questions or comments for David, please come up and speak to him directly. Thank you very much.
You were talking about direct, developmental, and reverse. Took me back to when we were working with the auditory synthesis.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can do that.
Yeah.
With a synthesizer, but with binaural, you can actually use real data.
Well, he actually had a room.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and they used a real chamber and a length of conduit with taps. Sennheiser microphone.
That's a hard way to do it, boy.
Great talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're welcome. Yes. Thank you.